Rebels and Traitors by Lindsey Davis. The subtitle of this book is An Epic History of the English Civil War. Book review. So this is one of those books that I just happened to stumble upon by chance one day while browsing through the bookstore. I recognized the author Lindsey Davis. I've never read anything by her, but I've seen that name around. Again, seen it when browsing through the bookstores. She does historical fiction. She's does a series of historical, like a couple of different series of historical fiction on ancient Rome, which I've seen but never picked up. One of those authors I've maybe been meaning to check out but never did. But this book caught my eye because I was interested in the history of the English Civil War, also known sometimes as the English Revolution. And it was historical fiction, and I enjoy learning history through historical fiction, so I decided to check it out, and I completely loved this book. It was a really entertaining book, completely fascinating. Now, you have to love history in order to get into this book. This is, it's fiction, it's historical fiction, but it's geared enough towards the historical fiction person who really likes getting into the history. So much so that there are actually sections of the book where Lindsey Davis actually gets away from the historical fiction narrative and just starts talking about the actual history with the English Civil War. So, there'll be pages at a time where it's just straight up history, which is not integrated into her fictional story about this English family. So on the one hand, she's got this story about this English family that's living through the English Civil War and their personal experience. And then alongside that, or interspersed with that, she'll have sections which are just straight up history. Short sections, but sections that go on for a few pages about what is actually happening in history at that time. Now, I don't think I've ever read a historical fiction book that does this, and I've got a feeling that there are historical fiction purists out there who might be upset by this. I don't know. Maybe these people only exist in my head, but I imagine there are some people who are saying, well, you can't do that. If you're writing a historical fiction novel, you have to integrate all the history into your narrative. It's cheating to have separate sections that are just catching the reader up on the history. I don't know. Do those people exist? Does anyone have those objections? The thought occurred to me as I was reading the book that this was kind of cheating, but then I thought, well, but who cares really? I as the reader am perfectly happy to have these history sections these history sections interspersed in this historical novel to catch me up on what's happening. I quite enjoyed it, actually. And if I, as the reader, am enjoying it, and if the author wants to do it, and we're both consenting adults here, so what's the harm? I quite liked it. And in fact, I found those historical sections, the straight up history sections, were really interesting, and I thought well written and fun to read. I think perhaps because Lindsey Davis has worked as a novelist, she can write really interesting prose when she's summarizing the history. In fact, maybe we ought to get all of our popular history books written by novelists. I don't know. I suspected that her skills as a novelist were paying off in writing engaging prose sections in the history. Maybe there's not a lot of crossover with that skill. I don't know. And I enjoyed it all the more so since I had been struggling to find a readable history on the English Civil War and couldn't find one. And by readable, by a readable history, I mean some something that's not dry and academic. So, for example, when I was at the university, I remember going to the library and looking for books on the English Civil War because this was a period I was interested in. And, there are plenty of books on it, but I couldn't find anything that was written for enjoyment. They all seem to be serious studies of the English Civil War. And by all means, if anyone knows of like a good readable history that's a popular history that's written for enjoyment, let me know in the comments of this video. But in the meantime, I would like to recommend this historical fiction book with bits of real history interspersed in it as a very readable history. So if nobody else has any recommendation, this book will do nicely. If you're looking to figure out, if you're looking to get some more information about the English Civil War. The other thing about the English Civil War, which comes through very clearly in this book, is that the historical figures at the beginning of the English Civil War are not the same figures who are around at the end of the Civil War. So, for example, Oliver Cromwell, who's such the dominant figure at the end of that period, is an obscure backbencher MP that nobody has ever heard of at the beginning of that period. And the beginning of that period is dominated by people like John Pym and the Earl of Essex, and all these people who are either dead or out of the picture completely by the time you get to the middle and the end of the period. So for those reasons, I think it would be difficult to integrate the English Civil War into a historical fiction narrative. You couldn't, I don't know, you could try to like do a historical fiction from Oliver Cromwell's perspective, but Oliver Cromwell wasn't a major figure at the beginning. Or you could try and do a historical fiction narrative from John Pym's perspective, but then he's dead by the time you get to the middle of that period. So I think maybe this is the best way forward. Having a normal English family who is experiencing the war and interacting with some of the historical figures, but then also having sections that are catching up the reader on what the broader picture of the war is. And she does a good job of this. The leveler movement is integrated into this. The leveler figures like John Lilburne, Richard Overton, Edward Saxby, Thomas Rainsborough, they all get, I think, decently fleshed out in this book. I'm sure there's more information to be had on them in the dry academic books in the library. But I felt like I came away from this book having gotten a lot of information about these figures. And also all those fascinating social and political movements that were in the period of the English Civil War. Political movements like the Levelers, which I already mentioned, and the Diggers, but also religious movements like the Ranters and the Fifth Monarchists are also integrated into this book so that you get a feel for them as well. I really enjoyed this book. I thought that I learned a lot. I found it absolutely fascinating. It's fiction in the sense that it was historical fiction, but it's historical fiction for people who like a lot of heavy history integrated into their fiction. Well, I say heavy. It's quite readable. What I mean is straight history integrated into their fiction. I do have a few nitpicks. So the book is 742 pages long. It's on the longer side when it comes to paperback books. It's quite readable, so the length isn't necessarily a complaint. But there are some plot threads that don't really go anywhere or don't have a satisfactory payoff. And the romance story I found contrived. Now, The romance story, in one sense, is the central backbone of the whole book because the whole narrative is leading up to that romance story. But it doesn't really click until the last 200 pages. So if you, like me, have a low tolerance for sappy romance stories that feel a little bit contrived, it's only really the last 200 pages out of 742 pages. But yeah, I didn't buy it. I felt like the main character, whose name was Gideon, I felt like he fell in love for really no reason. There was no reason internal to his character. It was just like the plot said it was time to fall in love. I also felt it wasn't characteristic of him. Up until this point in the book, he had been portrayed as very cautious, very reserved in speech, and cautious in love. But then once he falls in love, then he starts abandoning caution and reserve and starts writing long, gushing, rambling love letters to the heroine, which I thought was out of character. Although I don't know, maybe that's the whole point. Maybe the point is that the love has so transformed him that he goes from being this really reserved character to this really passionate character. I don't know. People who have read the book, let me know what you think about the romance in the comments below. In spite of those nitpicks, though, overwhelmingly it's a recommend if you like history. Again, if you're not interested in the history, stay well away from this book. There are other historical fiction books that won't bother you nearly as much with names and dates of historical figures. But if you like history, definitely recommend